October 4th, 1944, 1 a.m. The air in the private club basement, damp and smelling of spilled gin and betrayal, thickened the moment Luciano finished speaking. Bumpy Johnson sat across the small mahogany table, not moving, his hands resting lightly on the cane he used more for statement than support. He looked like royalty observing an amateur production. Luciano, freshly deported and pulling strings from Sicily through his proxies, Meyer Lansky, perched nervously near the exit, had made the offer. It was a formal decree disguised as a negotiation. Harlem was a gold mine. The numbers, the dope, the protection, it all flowed in torrents. And the Italian families wanted a taste, a constant, respectful tribute that Luciano's voice, smooth as polished steel, had delivered the verdict. 10%, Ellsworth. A token of respect. Our protection, your operation. 10%. Bumpy felt the number land like a shard of glass. A share of the profits. A pittance offered to a servant. A cut reserved for a peripheral player, not the architect of the entire damn kingdom. Bumpy Johnson was not peripheral. He was the center. The king of Harlem did not pay taxes to foreign lords. He built the roads that carried the wealth. Lansky shifted his weight, a silent alarm bell. Luciano leaned back, exhaling smoke that momentarily veiled his cold, assessing eyes. The unspoken threat in the room was louder than a cannon. Refusal meant war, a short, brutal affair that everyone expected the commission to win. Harlem would burn, and a new king would be installed, loyal to the Sicilian agenda. But Bumpy was not a man built for submission. He took a slow breath, letting the silence stretch until it was agonizing that he spoke finally, his voice low, measured, every word carrying the weight of the pavement he owned. Lucky, he said, using the man's first name, a deliberate disrespect that drew a sharp intake of breath from Lansky. I am the source, not the distributor. You want to touch the numbers I run? You want to feel the pulse of my streets? You don't ask for 10% of the harvest. You ask for 10% of the dirt. Bumpy paused, his eyes locked onto Luciano's. And I ain't giving up the dirt. The silence returned, now charged, electric. Harlem is mine. The revenue generated is predicated on my control. If you want 10%, you get 10% of nothing. Because if you try to take control, there will be nothing left but blood and smoke. This was not defiance. It was a geopolitical statement. Bumpy was not asking for a better deal. He was refusing the entire premise of the deal. He was demanding equal sovereignty. Luciano stared at the audacity of the man from the north, a man who understood leverage better than Wall Street. It was a confrontation that redefined the mob structure. The offer of 10% was retracted, but the conversation had forced a recognition. Ellsworth Johnson could not be bought cheap. He could only be recognized as an equal threat, forcing the commission to draft a new, unwritten rule. Harlem was an autonomous zone. Autonomy, a word they hated. A word that smelled like gunpowder and defiance in the pressure cooker of Manhattan, circa 1948. The commission's forced recognition that Harlem was an autonomous zone meant one thing. Ellsworth Johnson had stared down the most powerful criminal organization in the world and lived. But recognition is not friendship. It is merely a pause in aggression. The danger was not removed. It was simply put on notice, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. South of 110th Street, the empire of Lucky Luciano, and soon, the rising, lethal terror of Vito Genovese, controlled every single dock, every union, every politician, and the very flow of cash through the city's arteries. They viewed Harlem not as a separate kingdom, but as a rich, untapped market, a community of millions controlled by the wrong management. Every dollar flowing through Lenox Avenue was a dollar they felt inherently entitled to own. Bumpy's refusal of the 10% was more than negotiation. It was an act of economic and cultural war. It was the moment he declared he would not be an employee. He would be the sovereign proprietor of Black Manhattan. This declaration carried a weight measured instantly in potential retaliatory violence. The police were not protectors of Harlem. They were, in Bumpy's calculation, merely the publicly funded enforcement arm of downtown interests. If Bumpy failed, if his grip slipped even a millimeter, the entire NYPD machine, heavily influenced by Italian political leverage, would crush his operation, clearing the battlefield so the 5 families could walk north unchallenged. The stakes were impossibly high, transcending mere criminality. This wasn't simply about controlling narcotics or the numbers racket. This was about sovereignty, dignity, and the symbolic pride of an entire community that had been systematically excluded and exploited by the white power structure for generations. Bumpy Johnson, the king of Harlem, became the single, fragile membrane protecting the neighborhood from total annexation. If he fell, the pride established during the Harlem Renaissance would dissolve back into brutal colonial servitude. He had established the rule of autonomy, yes, but upholding it required constant, lethal vigilance against forces that operated not just on a city level, but on a global scale, trafficking drugs and silencing opposition from Cuba to Sicily. He understood that Luciano and Genovese had long memories, and a debt of disrespect was the highest interest rate in the underworld. His defiance had secured the zone, but now he was locked in a brutal, white-collar war, negotiating turf with men who controlled senators and ran the global heroin trade. The price of autonomy was measured nightly in the silence between gunshots, knowing that any perceived weakness, a bust, an illness, a betrayal, would trigger the full-scale invasion. The line was drawn absolutely at 110th Street. Bumpy stood alone on that line, understanding perfectly that if it moved 1 block south, the beating heart of Harlem would stop, and the legacy of his street kingdom would be erased by men who hated his power more than they feared the law. It was a grim November morning in 1941, the air thick with the exhaust of Lower Manhattan, when the word finally came down. The line at 110th Street was respected, but the men who controlled the docks and the policy banks saw Bumpy's autonomy as a personal affront to their sovereignty. Harlem was too rich, too isolated, too profitable to remain truly independent, regardless of the bloodshed required to take it. Lucky Luciano, speaking through the cold, surgical calculation of Meyer Lansky, decided the time for violence was past. A negotiated surrender was cleaner and far more insulting. Bumpy was summoned. He walked into the downtown headquarters, not a supplicant, but a monarch visiting a rival court. He moved with the gravity of a man who understood the historical weight of his own existence, understanding that the outcome of this meeting would define black organized crime for the next generation. The setup was intentional, a vast, overly decorated office, designed to make Bumpy feel small, surrounded by suits whose tailored silk spoke of old European tradition and untouchable power. They didn't see a king. They saw a highly effective, but ultimately disposable, foreman. They saw a resource that needed to be managed. The messenger, an underboss whose name now sits forgotten in the archives, smiled, offering what he clearly believed was a monumental concession, a path to peace that Bumpy should accept with tearful gratitude. The terms were laid out like an ultimatum draped in satin. Bumpy would continue to oversee distribution north of 110th Street. He would maintain operational control. But all product, all supply, all major protection came through them. The tribute demanded for his continued existence, the price of not being erased by a wave of shooters, was simple arithmetic, 10% of the gross receipts. The moment the percentage hit the air, Bumpy stopped breathing. 10%. They were offering the man who commanded the streets, who knew the pulse of his people, who owned the distribution network lock, stock, and barrel, the equivalent of a junior partner's commission. It was not an offer of alliance. It was an instruction from master to servant. They had completely, fundamentally misjudged the core of Ellsworth Johnson. They had mistaken his practicality for subservience, his patience for weakness. They believed the weight of their legacy and the threat of their power would make him buckle. Bumpy didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He sat perfectly still, observing the arrogance in the eyes of the man across the table, watching the smug surety that they had won before the negotiation even began. He let the silence stretch until it became heavy, suffocating the opulence of the room. Bumpy calculated not the cost of war, but the cost of that 10%. That small number was the total annihilation of his street dignity, the erasure of everything he had fought for since coming north from South Carolina. It was not just money. It was the entire concept of Harlem's economic self-determination handed over for crumbs. His reply, when it finally came, was delivered with a quiet, lethal precision that instantly shattered the illusion of the meeting. It was a reply so staggering in its historical audacity that it reverberated all the way up the commission ladder, forcing the ruling powers of the underworld to confront a reality they had actively tried to ignore. December 14th, 1937, mid-afternoon. The humid, overstuffed room on Mulberry Street smelled of old smoke and new intimidation. He had listened to the terms: protection, oversight, a guarantee of life, and 10% of the action to maintain the king's crown in Harlem, provided that crown heired ultimately to Rome. It was an insult draped in velvet, a proposition designed to confirm subservience, not partnership. Ellsworth Johnson leaned forward, his massive frame folding slightly, minimizing the threat, which only amplified it. He let the silence hang, heavy and complete, absorbing the weight of their arrogance, the historical condescension of men who believed ownership was simply a matter of declaration. This was the moment where the history of uptown crime diverged forever. 10%, he finally whispered, the sound sharp enough to cut glass. A tithe for my own territory. The lead negotiator, sensing the rejection, began to pivot, rehearsing the veiled threats about consequences and costs, about the inevitable price of defiance. But Bumpy waved a slow hand, stopping the monologue cold. Before you tell me what happens if I refuse, Bumpy continued, his voice now rising, measured and utterly calm. Allow me to inform you what happens if I accept. He paused, scanning the faces, the impatience turning immediately to cold confusion. You assume that Harlem is a stable asset, a ripe harvest waiting for your sickle. You assume I am the only factor. You have failed to audit your own books. He produced no documents, no ledgers. He simply stated the facts of their impending catastrophe. He detailed, street by street, how their own distribution lines were now compromised, their non-Bumpy operations paralyzed by internal strife he had quietly fermented over the preceding 6 months. The names of compromised dock foremen, the schedules of intercepted liquor trucks, the specific location of 2 hidden stills, operations run by families directly associated with the men sitting across the table. These were weaknesses only an insider, or a master opponent who moved 3 steps ahead, could possibly know. A cold, dreadful shock spread across the faces of the Italian delegation. They realized they were not negotiating with a subordinate. They were facing a declaration of economic war for which they were tragically unprepared. Bumpy had not just refused the 10%. He had proven that they needed him to fix the 90% they couldn't control. The humiliation was total. He did not ask for control. He simply stated that control was already his. He left the room untouched, the air thick with disbelief, the silence now owned entirely by Bumpy Johnson. The details of that meeting were reported directly to Lucky Luciano, and shortly thereafter, the nascent commission, the ruling body of American organized crime, convened an emergency session. They couldn't kill Bumpy. The chaos resulting from his death would destroy their existing infrastructure in the entire Northeast. They couldn't absorb him fully, because he would never submit. The unprecedented solution was forged in bitter necessity. Harlem was declared a neutral zone of economic self-governance, shielded from direct invasion. It was a rule created specifically for Ellsworth Johnson, ensuring that no single family could actively move against him without the commission's explicit, written permission. They had tried to buy the king for 10%, and instead, they enshrined his kingdom into the very constitution of the American Mafia. The official decree was finalized by the commission on the chilly evening of November 4th, 1937, a private ruling that reverberated through the underworld with the shock of a cannon shot. Luciano's men, already deep into plans of complete economic takeover, were forced into an immediate, humiliating retreat. The order was absolute, enforced by the highest council of American organized crime. Harlem was a sovereign entity, protected by an institutional firewall. Bumpy Johnson had not just defended his territory. He had compelled the nation's greatest criminal authority to rewrite their own constitution just to manage him. They had tried to purchase his loyalty with 10% of the action, a meager salary to become a glorified employee, a figurehead wearing their collar. His response, a stony silence followed by an outright refusal to submit, was an act of defiance so profound, so unyielding, that it broke their conventional playbook. Bumpy refused the leash and thus forced them to acknowledge his crown. The designation of the neutral zone of economic self-governance was, in reality, a desperate mechanism to maintain peace. The Commission knew Bumpy could not be bought, and killing him would provoke a chaotic, bloody power vacuum that would attract unwelcome federal attention. So, the ultimate concession was made. Johnson was enshrined as the undisputed ruler of Harlem's underworld economy. No family could interfere, no hit could be sanctioned. Without the explicit and documented permission of the Commission, a hurdle designed to be functionally impossible to clear. The message traveled instantly through the streets, passed along the lines of the policy runners and the speakeasy operators. The king had faced the entire might of the Italian syndicate, and he had emerged victorious, clutching a written guarantee of his sovereignty. The Italian pride was bruised, a permanent constitutional scar marking their inability to subjugate one man. Bumpy Johnson settled back into his reign with the quiet confidence of a monarch whose rule had just been ratified by his enemies. There were no loud celebrations, no parades, just a chilling, deeper stillness to his demeanor. He returned to the policy banks, the numbers flowing faster and safer than ever, now backed by the strange, inadvertent sanction of the nation's highest criminal body. Harlem saw it all. Harlem understood the gravity of his triumph. When the tidal wave had approached, threatening to drown the community in violence and outside control, Bumpy Johnson stood firm. He was the protector, the immovable barrier. The reverence for him solidified into something bordering on the mythical. He was no longer just a gangster. He was the king who had stared down the Leviathan and secured the economic independence of his kingdom. He had refused their 10%, and in doing so, he secured 100% of his autonomous reign, ushering in the golden age of his power. October 1934 marks the moment the definition of American crime changed forever. Luciano offered the fraction, 10%. He offered quiet compliance. He offered the cessation of the relentless war. Bumpy Johnson offered the only thing a true sovereign ever offers, defiance. He proved, unequivocally, that power is not about the size of the treasury. It is about the willingness to defend the border. When Bumpy refused that 10% cut, he was not just saying he was richer than the Italians. He was declaring that he was inherently freer. He was defining the exact boundaries of his kingdom, and those boundaries were sacred and non-negotiable. The king understood a simple truth that escapes most powerful men. If you accept a fraction to avoid a war, you have already lost 100% of your soul. The white man's rule would not touch the internal affairs of Harlem. That became the immutable law, carved into the concrete of 133rd Street. This refusal was not merely a business decision. It was a devastating political earthquake that rattled the very foundations of the national crime syndicate. Never before had a black leader of a major operation looked directly into the eyes of the Commission, the most powerful organization of criminals the world had ever known, and successfully demanded total, uncompromised autonomy. They could not simply wipe him out, not because of weakness, but because the ensuing chaos in Harlem would have destabilized the entire East Coast supply chain, threatening Luciano's meticulously organized structure. Lucky Luciano, the genius organizer, had to swallow the bitter, humiliating pill of reality. Bumpy Johnson secured an unprecedented peace, a peace born entirely from the credible, self-sacrificing threat of eternal war. Because of the king of Harlem's impossible, audacious stand, the Commission was eventually forced to create an unofficial, yet ironclad, internal mandate. The mandate was simple: never underestimate the cost of trying to control a man who values respect and sovereignty more than he values profit. Harlem instantly became untouchable ground, a recognized neutral territory, not through Italian charity, but through Bumpy's sheer terror and tactical brilliance. He earned something money could never buy: the fearful, genuine respect of the entire Cosa Nostra structure. He taught the world's most powerful criminals that there is a line you do not cross, even for a king like Luciano. Ellsworth Johnson was a gangster, yes, but he was also a philosopher of force. He taught us that true power is the ability to walk away from a deal everyone expects you to take. It is the sovereignty secured at gunpoint, upheld by sheer, uncompromising will. He set the undisputed standard for independent authority in the American underworld, a standard that remains unbroken to this day. But the story of Bumpy's golden reign is far from over. The price of peace is eternal vigilance, and the Commission never truly forgot the audacity of Harlem's king. If you want to witness how this tenuous truce fractured, how the golden age of Bumpy Johnson began its brutal countdown, you need to understand the men he fought next. So, if you respect the power of pure defiance, if you understand the weight of a man who chooses death over subservience, then you know what to do. Lock in. Hit that like button harder than Dutch Schultz hit the pavement. Subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, what is the most powerful lesson Bumpy Johnson ever taught the streets? Let's keep the legend alive.